From May 15th on, you continue to have refugees as people, wars coming close, they flee. And it's a combination of people fleeing, of some expulsions, and again, completely normal in war. There is nothing unique in the war here compared to anything happening at this time as empires collapse and new nations are established. They're called Arab refugees. There's about 700,000 of them. There are estimates ranging from a low of 500,000 to a high of 900,000. The common and accepted estimate is around 700,000. And they are mostly in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, some in Iraq. And here, the Arab countries are actually a bit different. First of all, it's important, like you said, those are armistice agreements. Those are not peace agreements, because the Arab countries are basically saying, we're stopping the fighting for now, apropos everyone asking for a ceasefire. Jordan, because it has a somewhat different history with the Jewish state, it's somewhat more acceptable of that idea, especially the Hashemites. They are actually willing to make peace with the Jewish state at the end of the war. They want to annex the West Bank. They naturalize the Arab refugees, and they do not demand anything from the Jewish state. But the Jordanian king, Abdullah, is actually murdered by a Palestinian over that issue. So ever since the Jordanians are kind of, jumpy and iffy on this issue. But Syria, Lebanon, Egypt with Gaza, they're very clear. We are not settling the Arab refugees. And the Arab refugees themselves, they're not some pawns. They refuse settlement too, because they say, if we're settled, the war is over. And that means that the Jewish state gets to stay. And that's unacceptable. What happens at this point is the refugee crisis across the world is massive. Again, this is post-World War II. Empires collapse, new states are established, borders are delineated, tens of millions of people flee across borders, and they're refugees. A lot of them are handled locally, without any assistance. Israel absorbs the Jewish refugees from the West Bank, from Gaza, from Jerusalem, from the Jewish quarter. It absorbs the Jewish refugees who are ethnically cleansed from across the Arab world, partly in revenge for the establishment of the State of Israel. They absorb all the Jewish refugees from Europe, from the displaced persons camps, and they do it without any international help. That's Israel and the Jewish refugees. Then you have other countries, Hindus and Muslims in India are ultimately absorbed, but in some places, a local agency is established in order to help the refugees be settled. So in order to understand UNRWA, which is for the Arab refugees, we should talk about UNCRA.
So it's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency
for Palestine Refugees,
okay,
which also included the Jews, but again, Israel took care of them. So at about the same time, another agency is established called UNCRA. The K is for Korea, for the Korean War and the refugees from the Korean War. And why is it a temporary agency like UNRWA? Because the idea is that you settle the refugees in a few short years and you move on, you close down, and it's over. Refugee crises were meant to be settled quickly and be over.
And to be clear, legally, the idea is if a refugee is made a refugee but finds a home somewhere else,
yes,
then they're no longer a refugee.
Of course. The general view and convention on refugees that applies to everyone in the world says basically there's three ways that refugees are settled. In the places to which they fled, if they can go home, great, or in a third place. And all of these are equivalent. They're equally good ways of ending a refugee situation. The entire refugee convention doesn't care who started what, who's to blame. It just cares about a person being able to start their new life. End of story.
Somewhere.
Yeah. Exactly. So the Koreans are settled 3.1 within a few short years with
3.1 million wow.
Korean refugees. A few short years, a third of the budget of UNRWA, and look at South Korea today.
And then the commission's disbanded.
The Arabs have UNRWA, and they refuse to settle. They refuse to go the path of the Koreans. And what they do is the British and the Americans want to close down UNRWA by the 50s, the end of the 50s. They're like, they look at UNRWA. UNRWA already settled 3.1 million. They're like, this UNRWA is achieving nothing. It's useless. It hasn't settled one Arab refugee. So we're going to close it down. So there was no question that UNRWA was a failed project. This is the moment of the Eisenhower Doctrine, oil, the Cold War. So the Arabs come to the Americans in a kind of mob-style scene, which we describe in the book, and they say, you don't want to make another mistake. You made one mistake. You allowed a Jewish state to emerge. You're not going to close down UNRWA. So from the beginning, in the Arab mindset, UNRWA was the antidote to the existence of the Jewish state. Mm-hmm. Keeping the Arab refugees from settling was the way to essentially send the message that the war in which the Jewish state declared independence was a bump in the road. And what the Arabs do with UNRWA is that they do three things that plague us to this day. The first is they make sure that the agency is called UNRWA, UN. It's not really a UN body. It's a temporary instrument established by the General Assembly to solve a specific problem. It's not a UN organ. But they wanted it to be called UN because in the Arab perspective and imagination, the UN created Israel and the UN is responsible for the refugees. It's certainly not the Jews who created Israel. Then they made sure that when the UN created the actual refugee agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugee, they created a loophole for UNRWA because they understood very clearly that if the Arab refugees from the war will be treated like all of the refugees in the world, and they looked at what the international standards were, they understood that within a few years there's going to be no Arab refugees and the Jewish state gets to stay. And no, that's unacceptable. And then they make sure that UNRWA never closes so that the loophole is always maintained. Okay, so now that they've created this loophole and this little fiefdom, the Arabs essentially take over UNRWA. Beginning in the 60s, UNRWA essentially becomes a Palestinian organization. It becomes the welfare, healthcare, education system of the now increasingly known as Palestinians, waiting to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And in the service of this perpetuation of the refugee status until the moment that the Jewish state is no more, until that moment, they begin to essentially inflate the number of refugees in a variety of ways. The first is by creating a really bizarre definition of a refugee that is not the international definition, just about being 2 years in here and losing livelihood. And that's not, generally refugees, it's about personal persecution. Okay, so first they inflate the numbers by having a different definition. They inflate the numbers by creating this hereditary status.
Which doesn't apply to any other refugee group.
In other refugee situations, the descendants of refugees can individually apply for a dependent status. It's not a refugee status, it's a dependent. They have to be under 18, and the status personally has to justify it. Mm-hmm. This kind of automatic generation after generation, no looking at personal situation, that's only for the Arab refugees. So first of all, it's important to say the Arab refugees are created in the course of war, where they are part of the fighting side. That's entirely normal. The Jews are ethnically cleansed from across the Arab world. Defenseless Jews. They're trying to ethnically cleanse the Jews who stand up and have their defense. But defenseless Jews from communities, again, that predated Islam and the Arab conquest of the 7th century are ethnically cleansed essentially overnight. And the Jews find a home in some other countries, but mostly in the state of Israel, which now exists, and unlike the 1930s, exists, controls its borders, and can open its borders and its gates to Jewish immigration. Israel absorbs hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from across the Arab world. And in parallel, just to understand the scale, in parallel, it absorbs the Jewish refugees, again, from the war, from the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza, and from Europe and the displaced persons camps. It absorbs all of them without international assistance, with a lot of Jewish world assistance, but without official international assistance, no UNRWA. It's a remarkable story of Israel and doing that essentially within a decade. And they're all absorbed into the state of Israel. And again, that's normal. A lot of countries absorbed refugees that had a similar ethnic, national, linguistic, religious makeup. That's very typical. Nowhere would countries receive refugees who belonged to a group that waged war. So a lot of people say, you know what, we don't care how the Arab refugees were created in war. Israel should have taken them back. In saying that, Israel is asked to do what no country was asked to do at the time. It was clearly understood that if people belonged to a national, ethnic, linguistic, religious group that just waged war, they were absorbed typically by the countries that had a similar ethnic makeup, and that was it.
Yeah, especially if they were the aggressors, especially if that country was the aggressor in that war.
Yeah, and just waged a violent war. And, you know, the notion that a country will be forced to receive a group that just waged war on it, I mean, it's nonsensical, and yet this was demanded of Israel.